Chapter 4, Part 2 of Queen Victoria. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Queen Victoria by Giles Lytton Strachey. Chapter 4, Part 2. 3. Albert had foreseen that his married life would not be all plain sailing, but he had by no means realized the gravity and the complication of the difficulties which he would have to face. Politically, he was a cipher. Lord Melbourne was not only Prime Minister, he was, in effect, the private secretary of the Queen, and thus controlled the whole of the political existence of the sovereign. A Queen's husband was an entity unknown to the British Constitution. In state affairs there seemed to be no place for him, nor was Victoria herself at all unwilling that this should be so. "The English," she had told the Prince when, during their engagement, a proposal had been made to give him a peerage, "are very jealous of any foreigner interfering in the government of this country, and have already in some of the papers expressed a hope that you would not interfere. Now, though I know you never would, still, if you were a peer, they would all say the Prince meant to play a political part. I know you never would." In reality she was not quite so certain, but she wished Albert to understand her views. He would, she hoped, make a perfect husband, but as for governing the country, he would see that she and Lord M. between them could manage that very well, without his help. But it was not only in politics that the Prince discovered that the part cut out for him was a negligible one. Even as a husband, he found, his functions were to be of an extremely limited kind. Over the whole of Victoria's private life the Baroness reigned supreme, and she had not the slightest intention of allowing that supremacy to be diminished by one iota. Since the accession her power had greatly increased. Besides the undefined and enormous influence which she exercised through her management of the Queen's private correspondence, she was now the superintendent of the royal establishment and controlled the important office of the Privy Purse. Albert very soon perceived that he was not master in his own house. Every detail of his own and his wife's existence was supervised by a third person. Nothing could be done until the consent of Lehzen had first been obtained, and Victoria, who adored Lehzen with unabated intensity, saw nothing in all this that was wrong. Nor was the Prince happier in his social surroundings. A shy young foreigner, awkward in ladies' company, unexpansive and self-opinionated, it was improbable that, in any circumstances, he would have been a society success. His appearance, too, was against him. Though in the eyes of Victoria he was the mirror of manly beauty, her subjects, whose eyes were of a less Teutonic cast, did not agree with her. To them, and particularly to the high-born ladies and gentlemen who naturally saw him most, what was immediately and distressingly striking in Albert's face and figure and whole demeanour was his un-English look. His features were regular, no doubt, but there was something smooth and smug about them. He was tall, but he was clumsily put together, and he walked with a slight slouch. Really, they thought, this youth was more like some kind of foreign tenor than anything else. These were serious disadvantages, but the line of conduct which the Prince adopted from the first moment of his arrival was far from calculated to dispel them. Owing partly to a natural awkwardness, partly to a fear of undue familiarity, and partly to a desire to be absolutely correct, his manners were infused with an extraordinary stiffness and formality. Whenever he appeared in company he seemed to be surrounded by a thick hedge of prickly etiquette. He never went out into ordinary society. He never walked in the streets of London. He was invariably accompanied by an equerry when he rode or drove. He wanted to be irreproachable, and if that involved friendlessness, it could not be helped. Besides, he had no very high opinion of the English. So far as he could see, they cared for nothing but fox hunting and Sunday observances. They oscillated between an undue frivolity and an undue gloom. If you spoke to them of friendly joyousness, they stared, and they did not understand either the laws of thought or the wit of a German university. Since it was clear that with such people he could have very little in common, there was no reason whatever for relaxing in their favour the rules of etiquette. In strict privacy he could be natural and charming. Seymour and Anson were devoted to him, and he returned their affection, but they were subordinates, the receivers of his confidences and the agents of his will. From the support and the solace of true companionship he was utterly cut off. A friend, indeed, he had, or rather a mentor. The Baron, established once more in the royal residence, was determined to work with as wholehearted a detachment for the Prince's benefit as more than 20 years before he had worked for his uncles. The situations then and now, similar in many respects, were yet full of differences. Perhaps in either case the difficulties to be encountered were equally great, but the present problem was the more complex and the more interesting. The young doctor who, unknown and insignificant, had nothing at the back of him but his own wits and the friendship of an unimportant prince, had been replaced by the accomplished confidant of kings and ministers, ripe in years, in reputation, and in the wisdom of a vast experience. It was possible for him to treat Albert with something of the affectionate authority of a father. But, on the other hand, Albert was no Leopold. As the Baron was very well aware, he had none of his uncle's rigidity of ambition, none of his overweening impulse to be personally great. He was virtuous and well-intentioned, he was clever and well-informed, but he took no interest in politics, and there were no signs that he possessed any commanding force of character. Left to himself, he would almost certainly have subsided into a high-minded nonentity, an aimless dilettante, busy over culture, a palace appendage without influence or power. But he was not left to himself. Stockmar saw to that. Forever at his pupil's elbow, the hidden Baron pushed him forward with tireless pressure along the path which had been trod by Leopold so many years ago. But this time the goal at the end of it was something more than the mediocre royalty that Leopold had reached. The prize which Stockmar, with all the energy of disinterested devotion, had determined should be Albert's, was a tremendous prize indeed. The beginning of the undertaking proved to be the most arduous part of it. Albert was easily dispirited. What was the use of struggling to perform in a role which bored him, and which, it was quite clear, nobody but the dear good Baron had any desire that he should take up? It was simpler, and it saved a great deal of trouble, to let things slide. But Stockmar would not have it. Incessantly he harped upon two strings: Albert's sense of duty and his personal pride. Had the Prince forgotten the noble aims to which his life was to be devoted? And was he going to allow himself, his wife, his family, his whole existence, to be governed by the Baroness Lehzen? The latter consideration was a potent one. Albert had never been accustomed to giving way, and now, more than ever before, it would be humiliating to do so. Not only was he constantly exasperated by the position of the Baroness in the royal household, there was another and a still more serious cause of complaint. He was, he knew very well, his wife's intellectual superior, and yet he found, to his intense annoyance, that there were parts of her mind over which he exercised no influence. When, urged on by the Baron, he attempted to discuss politics with Victoria, she eluded the subject, drifted into generalities, and then began to talk of something else. She was treating him as she had once treated their Uncle Leopold. When at last he protested, she replied that her conduct was merely the result of indolence, that when she was with him she could not bear to bother her head with anything so dull as politics. The excuse was worse than the fault. Was he the wife and she the husband? It almost seemed so.